Good afternoon everyone and welcome to this Change Board webinar, How Will T-Levels Affect Business? My name is Mary Appleton and I'm Change Board's editor. We're delighted to be joined today by Kirstie Donnelly, Managing Director at the City and Guilds Group, and Anthony Impey, Chief Executive of Optimity. From 2020, new technical qualifications called T-Levels are promising to simplify the process of vocational education in the UK. But just what are T-Levels and what do they mean for your business? Kirstie and Anthony will be discussing what steps you can take to effectively prepare for T-Levels being launched and how they could contribute positively to your future talent strategy. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few guidelines. Throughout the webinar, if you'd like to pose a question or a comment to Kirstie or Anthony, please do enter this in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen and click Send. We'll be taking questions after the presentation, but please feel free to pose the question at any time and we'll try and get through as many as we can later on. There'll also be a couple of polls throughout the presentation which will flash up on your screen, so just follow the on-screen instructions to vote and we'll allow around 30 seconds per poll. We'll also be running a live Twitter feed throughout the webinar, so be sure to credit your tweets with @ChangeBoard and @CityGuildsGroup and Optimity Limited. We'll also be recording this webinar, so we'll send you a link to the full recording in the next few days. In a moment, I'll hand over to Kirstie, who is a Managing Director at the City and Guilds Group, responsible for the City and Guilds, ILM and Digital Me brands. She joined the City and Guilds Group in 2011 and has worked at the forefront of skills and education for the last 30 years. So, over to you, Kirstie.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mary. Thank you for that introduction, and also welcome Anthony, who I know is also joining for this, what will hopefully be very interesting, engaging discussion. I think probably the first thing I wanted to say is thank you to all of our audience, and as employers, the important role that you potentially can play in what is probably some of the most systemic, fundamental change we've seen in our skills system for the last, I would say, 30 years. But why does all this matter to you? What would be your call to action when we think about the T-level reforms? And I guess my angle on that, and we'll certainly test that out in this webinar today, is that as employers, you want to be assured that you are going to be getting the best possible future talent coming out of the education system. And I suppose the question is, do you feel you are today? And if not, if you're being let down, why are you being let down? And therefore, how important will this reform be in trying to deliver what ultimately you need from the education system? It's important to remember this reform is not currently active. It is only currently being proposed. In fact, there was a consultation process that closed on the 8th of February, but there's still going to be plenty of opportunities for us to discuss this reform with the policy advisors in government. And so in many respects, today is also about you having your say and an opportunity for both Anthony and I, who also work in the sector, to be able to put some of those views back. So let's really get on with really trying to understand what lies behind some of the T-level reforms. But before we do that, we wanted to just run our own poll with you, the audience, listening in today, and just get a feel for how aware are you already of the government's plans for T-levels. So we're going to pose a poll question now, and it's a simple poll question which literally is, are you aware of the government plans for T-levels? And you've got three choices there. Yes, you're either fully aware, you've heard of T-levels, but you don't know the details, or you know nothing about T-levels. That poll should be open right now for you to make those choices. Anthony, just while we're having our audience today make those choices of answers, what do you think might come out from that, actually? It's going to be quite interesting to see the diversity of view in terms of where people are in their understanding.
I mean, I think it's interesting. I think that to some extent there's quite a lot of noise for employers at the moment around vocational education. And so we've all been bombarded by messages around the apprenticeship and the apprenticeship levy. And if you're a levy payer, you've almost certainly been bombarded with communication from the Department of Education, which I think is really, really important. I think if you compare T-levels to that amount of noise, it's been relatively quiet. And so I'm anticipating that actually a lot of employers may have heard about T-levels, but really don't have the clarity around really what they mean, and certainly what they mean for their particular organisations.
Yeah. No, I think you're probably right. And I think we've actually got a pretty much 100% in on answering that poll result. So we may well have an answer coming up now. And I think if I would probably be with you on that, not least having been quite close to the reforms over the last year or so, they've been passing through Parliament. I'm not sure I'm fully aware, Anthony, given how much they keep changing. So it'll be interesting to see what our audience are saying today. And it's looking like 38% have actually heard about T-levels, and another 38 know nothing about T-levels. So that's essentially looking, which
they either don't know anything or know about it but don't know what it means.
Exactly. So I'll be interested if we go through today's debate to see where we land at the end, really. And so moving on, let's give our audience some context, really, about why this reform is so needed. I touched a moment ago on, why might it matter to all of those employers who are listening in on this webinar today? And my assumption is that it's because you very much care and are passionate about the businesses that you look after and run and your future talent needs. And in many respects, if we were being positive about the reform, and Anthony, you've already hinted at the amount of reform that seems to be happening over the last couple of years around skills generally, not least with the apprenticeship levy. But this reform is very specifically about that full-time 16 to 18-year-old coming out of school, going into going into a sixth form or going into a college and thinking about what their future next 2 years of study might be. And the reason the government are doing, and it's quite a laudable reason, is because they have recognised that they need to create a technical education system that's fit for the 21st century, implying, of course, that we haven't had one that's been fit for the 21st century. And I think, again, that's a view, Anthony, I'm sure you'd have a comment on, because I think in many respects the education system has been failing employers to date. What's your view of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always when you talk about this from an employer's point of view, it's always kind of quite easy to kind of point at the education system and say it's not producing the people we need for the workforce and for the skills gap that we have in organisations. And I think the real challenge is that if you're in the education system, you're in a system where success is measured by the number of students that you send to university, and so schools are sending the vast majority of their young people to university, and I don't think that necessarily is what employers want or are looking for. And certainly there are some jobs where you need to have a degree. I certainly wouldn't want to be operated on by somebody who didn't have a medical degree. But equally, there are lots and lots of jobs, including a lot of the jobs in the sector that my business Optimity is in the tech sector. A lot of the jobs that we have in the tech sector are not dependent on having a degree. And some of the best people that come through the sector have actually taken alternative pathways and haven't gone to university, and they've developed their skills and their technical skills elsewhere, and they are kind of leaders in their field. So I definitely the system isn't producing the caliber of people that the business community needs, but I think it's a reflection on what success looks like to a school, and success looks like sending lots of people to university. So for as long as we've got that as a success measure, there's a real challenge that the education system will just keep doing it. Having said that, I'm quite hopeful that actually things are changing, and that the T-level proposals start shifting that emphasis more to the skills that employers need.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think you've touched on a very interesting point there about the number of graduates, and we did some research a couple of years ago, which clearly demonstrated that by 2022, so not that far away at all, and certainly within the timelines of when we expect these T-levels to be out in the system, so to speak, only 30% of jobs will actually require graduate level training. So I think we have got a bit of a sort of a mismatch here between the aspirations of young people and where schools are directing young people versus actually where are the skill needs and what is it that employers want. And in many respects, this slide that we should all be able to see now really poses the 4 areas that the government really felt lay behind wanting to make this systemic change to the technical education system. these obviously simplified versions of what the government is saying, but problem one, too many overlapping low quality qualifications, too much confusion in the system about what those qualifications stand for. So what we need is clearer technical routes that link through to skilled employment. Two, there's a fragmented provider base, whereas what's actually needed is a much stronger, locally responsive to employer needs, so therefore a responsive provider base to meet those needs. Three, there aren't enough apprenticeship opportunities, something you've just touched on, Anthony, where we see more and more schools pushing their young people straight into HE academic options because that's all they know or that's all they're judged on. So until we change those measurement routes, that's always going to be an issue. So having the apprenticeship levy policy come before the technical education policy, you might argue, has already started this debate. But one of the most important things about the T-level reform is going to be how do the T-levels lock into the apprenticeships, and I think that's going to be something that we'll talk about in a moment. And then problem four, again, something you just touched on, Anthony, lack of career advice and guidance, that we really do need to be thinking about how we put right this ongoing problem. I don't know if you remember when you had careers advice and guidance coming out from school, but I remember mine, and it was pretty potluck. I think it was some random survey where I had to fill in, and it told me I was going to do something that I never imagined I ever would do. So these are the four key problems that have been highlighted as being part of the reform.
I think there's a fifth point actually that the government hasn't pulled out, but I think is really, really important, and I just see lacking in so many young people that come to Optimity for an interview, which is that actually young people don't have work experience, and it's just staggering. I will interview graduates that have got been really, really successful through school and university, and yet they have almost no, in some instances, no work experience whatsoever. And that is terribly damaging to somebody's career prospects, because actually that work experience and meaningful work experience, I think, adds so much value to someone's career prospects. And I'm surprised that the government didn't highlight that need for work experience. And I always like to talk about the UK Commission for Employment Skills. They wrote a report 3-4 years ago now called The Death of the Saturday Job. And I think those skills that are learned through Saturday jobs, or jobs in the evening, and reminiscing a little on my paper round that I did when I was but they're really important skills, and young people aren't equipped with them, with those skills anymore.
I think you're absolutely right, and one of the things we're going to come back to as we go through this webinar today will be the whole issue of work placement. And to be fair, one of the things government have recognised is just how important it is now to embed back into technical and professional education. As you're suggesting, that work experience, the question is, how do you do that? How do you create a system so it isn't just 2 weeks sat next to a filing cabinet making coffee? Although, don't get me wrong, there is even some value in those particular skills. And as you say, valuing your paper round job was a little like my valuing my job cutting lettuces age 12 at a lettuce farm. But the point I'm trying to make is I totally agree with you. There are a whole heap of skills that we were able to access that just don't seem to be available now for young people. But getting that work experience, work placement right is going to be quite a difficult task, and we will touch on that in a moment. The one other fact that I probably just wanted to position here for our audience today is really what's at the heart of this is the government wanting to create a parity of esteem with A-levels. We all understand the A-level brand, we all understand the university brand. We've never been quite able to get our heads around what's the currency associated with technical education, and so in many respects T-levels are around trying to create that parity of currency with A-levels. But again, later on we will touch on some of the problems with that, because what the T-level reform is ultimately going to do is force a binary choice for a young person at 16 to choose a T-level over choosing A-levels, which I don't think creates parity. I think actually could even lead to greater social injustice. So I think that's a theme that we will come back to in a moment. But just moving forward, I think it's important for our audience to know there is a timeline behind these T-levels. As I said before, these reforms aren't actually out in the system yet. They're currently being consulted on. It is like with a lot of government plans, a moving timeline. In fact, I can probably safely say it won't be long before some of that September 2020, which is when there's plans to actually deliver some pilots in 3 of the Pathfinder routes, childcare and education, construction and one aspect of digital. I won't be surprised if we see that timeline gets pushed back even further. But the point is the government are definitely on an agenda here to make sure that by the time we get to 2024, there is some level of new adoption for this new system. Now, of course, if one was being cynical, you might say, well, there's an election somewhere between now and then, so what might happen? But I do think that, you know, we are at a point in our technical and professional education system where we do need to find a way to introduce some constructive, positive change. The other important thing about this timeline is to say that what fundamentally sits behind it is a different approach to how many awarding bodies will be operating in the sector by the time we get to 2024. The proposal for the moment is that there would only be potentially one awarding body per different route. So that really does start to bring the number of choice down, potentially for the people going on T-levels and, of course, ultimately for employers. So I think really all there is to say about this timeline is it's watch this space. But as you can see, there's a lot that needs to happen between now and 2024 before we see full adoption of T-levels coming through, and before you as employers start to really get involved from about 2021 onwards in getting involved in those all important aspects of work placement. Anthony, I don't know if there's anything you particularly wanted to say about the implementation of T-levels and how you might feel, how realistic it is that we can expect employers over the next year or so to start to actively get more and more involved in something that they're not even quite sure yet what it might mean for them.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of aspects. One is, you know, when you look at this timeline, it's very, very ambitious, and we're talking about a huge overhaul of the education system in order to create a parallel qualification to A-levels. So, you know, when you look at the timeline, and the scale of the task ahead, it's very, very challenging. Having said that, I think, you know, the reality of Brexit Britain is looming. We already have a skills crisis in almost every sector of the economy. I don't speak to a single business owner or HR person who doesn't say that their sector has got the worst skills crisis. So I don't think we have a choice. That actually we have to move quickly. That the scale of the tasks and the short timelines are just the reality of what we're facing in the years ahead. So I think we have to do this. In terms of the sectors, you know, they are sectors that are in the instance of construction certainly are most at risk as a result of Brexit. And I think in terms of digital, it's seen as one of the areas of the economy that will help drive our competitive advantage post the exit from Europe. So I think it's probably right to kind of pick those three. The timeline feels uncomfortable, but I don't think we really have a choice.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably a very salient point to move on to the next slide, because, you know, bearing in mind that timeline that we've just discussed, what I haven't yet described, which this slide goes on to do, is what are the 15 technical education routes to be rolled out over that time period that we've just been talking about. And here you can see them very, very clearly. You've got the 3 in green, which are the pathways. They're the kind of testing out some of the pathways from the full route. So the software application design is a pathway within digital being obviously much bigger than that one particular occupational area. And again, building services is just one pathway of the bigger construction route, and the same with the childcare route. So I think you're right. I think there's an element of reality bites here, because in every single one of those areas you can see up there on that slide, I don't think there's any one that doesn't suffer from some form of either skills need retraining, or there is actually a skills gap, this oxymoron of too many jobs that don't have people in it and too many people without jobs. And clearly this is one way of trying to get that skills mismatch brought back closer together. What is interesting, though, again, about this particular slide here, I think the 2 important points I would make is to say, just let's remember that these 15 routes, 4 of which are apprenticeship routes only, why those 4 have been chosen for apprenticeship only routes, the ones that are in the yellow box, transport, sales, social care and protective services, is a little bit still in question. I think there are probably some practical issues around, can colleges and sixth form colleges really teach those, in inverted commas. Perhaps it's been a pragmatic reason why those 4 have been earmarked as only being available as apprenticeship routes only, leaving the other 11 as being the level 3 that we were talking about before. And so I suppose that does bring us back to this issue about why is the T-level route only for level 3, and what happens then to those all important level 2 occupational areas.
I couldn't agree more. I'll be honest. I think the thing is that there seems to be a bit of an obsession around always increasing the level of qualification, because somehow that will help fill the skills gap. And the reality is there's lots of level 2. There's lots of jobs that require a level 2 qualification, and arguably. Potentially in construction and in childcare, traditionally they have been sectors which have used level 2 qualifications a great deal. So to think that we can fill the skills gap by increasing the level of qualification, I think misreads what businesses really want. And I think it's there's a couple of things that strike me about the different pathways. One is, have the pathways been truly tested amongst employers? Are these really the skills that employers are crying out for, and there's a clear need in the economy for these particular skills? And the other thing is actually, do young people want to follow these career pathways? And are we doing enough to make sure that we have the talent pipeline that want to study these areas? Because we might have all the jobs in the world in these fields, but if young people don't want to pursue those careers, that's something that also has to be looked at and fixed.
Yeah, and I think you've just raised another couple of important points I draw out. And back up just on that last point, I mean, that's where the link, of course, is back to that conversation we were having a few minutes ago about that all-important careers advice and guidance. If young people don't know about the variety of occupational choices that exist in even just one area like construction, how will they ever know that it's going to be a potential career route for them to pursue? But you raised 2 points there that I'd like to come back to, really. One, which is, it's worse than what you just said about, how will young people even want to choose any of those? It's actually, there could even be a postcode lottery here, because actually, because of the way the rollout is planned, it's planned that from 2021 there'll only be selected providers running any one of those routes that you can see in the dark blue there, and then the others will follow on from 2022 onwards to 2024. But actually, because we don't yet know how that's going to be implemented, those selected providers, then if you happen to be someone living out in a rural area in Lincolnshire, for example, and you want to be looking at a career in education, engineering and manufacturing, but actually your provider there isn't delivering that T-level, or there's no employees in that area who are being married to that, then you're not going to have that opportunity to be able to pursue that skill and career. So I think there are some quite worrying things around how this gets implemented that could actually force a bit of a postcode lottery choice, really, which again is almost undermining the whole spirit of T-levels, which should be about opening up choice and broadening the horizons for young people, as well as factoring in what is it that industry actually needs.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
think this.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to jump in there. The Federation of Small Business have done a lot of research around this, and they've found one of the key barriers for young people to take up apprenticeships, just as a parallel, is the lack of adequate public transport, especially once you get out of the main city.
Exactly.
Actually, and so if it's difficult to get to these particular colleges that are delivering these qualifications, then actually, it's a very practical barrier that prevents young people being able to start these qualifications, even if they really want to do them, follow the pathways.
Absolutely right. I think that's another aspect of that whole postcode lottery point. And then the other point you raised, which I think is worth just pulling out, and again, it's a conversation I know we've had before, I know we've had with the Industry Skills Board that you also sit on, Anthony, but is this whole issue about the the progression between T-levels into apprenticeships. So we've heard a lot of employers tell us that, look, even if it is at a level 3, this parity to this A level, you know, hospitality and catering being a very good example, we wouldn't necessarily as an employer accept that level 3 into an apprenticeship, and we may need to start that young person back at a level 2. Well, that just seems like, you know, if that's the case, we should be listening to employers about the design of that, because that doesn't seem like progression for either the young person moving from a T-level into an apprenticeship, say in hospitality and catering, and nor is it a sensible use of funding, really, if what we're going to be doing is repeating things or having to go back to some of the basics.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I think that I mean, I think you summed up really well one of the key barriers that employers have, because actually, if as an employer you sponsor it, you get involved in T-level, you offer somebody work experience, but then there's no clear progression from the T-level qualification into the next stage up of an apprenticeship, then actually it's a huge amount of wasted time for employers, and whether you're a big company or a small company, there's not a single company out there that can afford to waste that kind of time. You know, there's as I keep coming back to, you know, there is a skills gap in almost every part of the economy, and employers are really happy to. I think employers are really happy to step up and respond to the challenge. But if it's not joined together and the system somehow doesn't link a level 2 to naturally go to a level 3, regardless of whether it's an apprenticeship or a T-level, that's got to be fixed, and that does have to be sorted out by the education system if the government wants employers to, you know, be active participants in this policy.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, and sort of, you know, moving on from that now, because I think hopefully what we've given our audience so far is a very quick flavour of the policy agenda and the why it's changing, a flavour for the actual routes that are going to be involved in the timeline. What we haven't told our audience today, sort of listening patiently, is what will actually make up a T-level programme. You know, what will this young person coming out after 2 years have? What will it look like? And this, again, this slide, obviously an oversimplification, of course, of what is essentially 1,800 hours of teaching is what I think the T-level programme transpires to in those 2 years. This is on a page what someone will actually study. So what we've got there is something called core skills. So they're all the skills at a level 3, again, this equivalent to this A level. These core skills that underpin the T-levels, a common framework for employability skills, helping young people with skills like researching and planning, commercial management, all of those skills that we often hear employers saying they wish young people would come to them already having got some of that, because often the employer themselves can actually teach the technical. What they want is that more work savvy person ready for the world of work. So those core skills are sort of embedded in that whole area, and they will be graded. And then there's the actual occupational specialism. So whatever the T-level route is that a young person has chosen, be it construction or engineering or childcare and so on, as we saw from those 15 routes earlier. And then there's the all-important maths and English debate. So anyone going on to a T-level will either have already achieved their GCSE in maths and English or functional skills, or be studying to it at a level 2. So essentially what that means, Anthony, is that you cannot actually pass through a T-level. You can't actually qualify as having had a T-level unless you've got those maths and English skills at level 2 as a minimum. And then there are some other aspects around other activities like license to practice, could even take account of things like all important Duke of Edinburgh awards and such like. But then we've got that yellow box over there in the left hand corner talking about this all important work placement, this sort of minimum almost 3 months of intense work placement. To be fair, the government are saying that can be quite flexibly applied, doesn't always have to be in one block, but the point is that it is going to be mandated. So somehow you imagine you're talking about literally thousands of young people in any 1 year who are going through their T-level, then needing to find a 3-month equivalent work experience placement with a suitable employer in their occupational area. So it's a very laudable commitment. It's also a very challenging commitment to think about how will employers really be able to implement such a development. But that is what makes up a T-level programme, and perhaps what we should do is really this focus now on this all-important work placement element, because I think probably that's what you, Anthony, and our audience today have got the most to potentially say about, because these are the proposals that the government are making so far. We've already talked about the fact that it needs to be 3 months, whether it's taken in one block or several. It has to be external, it has to be real life, it has to be a real job role within an actual employer. It has to help the applied understanding of the technical area the young person is studying. And of course, you know, the employer will need to provide feedback to the student. So that's essentially what the work placement is looking like at the moment. How it works, well, I think that's going to be anyone's question right now, but be interesting at this point, Anthony, to get a view on that from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, I mentioned earlier, you know, the need for young people to have work experience in order to really kickstart their career, and the importance of it. I think from an employer's point of view, there is a challenge to be able to commit this kind of time to a work experience or work placement without really knowing what the underlying value proposition is. I think employers will do so much from a corporate social responsibility point of view and giving back to the communities in which it operates. But at the same time, I think employers are looking for some value out of operating a work placement. I'm sure the newsagent that enabled me to do a paper round was in part thinking about the corporate social responsibility that he was fulfilling, but also about the important business function of delivering newspapers. And I think it's important not to lose sight of that businesses will readily support this programme if there's a clear business benefit from being involved. And the challenge with work experience is that you are taking young people into the business and they have a limited number of skills. And so how can you give them work experience that is related to the T level, which is the third criteria on the list that you just had up, but also adds value to the organisation. And I think reflecting from a relatively small business point of view, and we've got 80 people within Optimity, so we're larger than a lot of small businesses, but there is always that management challenge or that management overhead that you've got to invest if you're going to deliver high quality work placements for young people. And I think that's the big challenge for larger organisations where scale allows them to put together structured programs and to deliver a holistic business experience or business experience related to the contents of a particular T-level qualification. That's much easier to achieve than in smaller organisations where there's far fewer resources and every minute of every day counts. And I think and I think engaging small businesses is fundamental if this policy is going to work. If we have a handful of the UK's biggest employers offering T levels, it's just not going to give the scale of opportunity that young people need, and also it's not going to give the work placement opportunities that young people need on their doorstep, because actually, again, small businesses have this geographic distribution and geographic reach that very few large corporates have. And so we've got to engage with small businesses. Small businesses won't engage because they don't have enough time in order to put together a meaningful program. And so you kind of have this real challenge around how do we get small businesses on board.
And do you imagine that, you know, because I know you're very passionate about this and giving young people every maximum opportunity, and I know Optimity is something you very much care about in terms of your own work with apprenticeships, but do you see yourself providing work experience placements for T-level for people who might take that digital route? You know, do you think that's something that you will, although despite those struggles and challenges that you've just very well articulated, do you still think that Optimity will actually want to try and take on a work experience T-level?
We see. I mean, as you say, you know, we do a lot of work with offering opportunities to young people, but as a general rule, we don't offer 2-week work experiences within Optimity. And the reason we don't do that is because we don't believe as an organisation that delivers value to either the organisation or the young person. And in those situations, unfortunately, the best the young person can do is go and make the coffee, because how can you assimilate somebody into an organisation in a 2-week period that's never worked in an organisation before? And so as a general rule, we don't do 2-week work experiences. However, we've engaged very successfully with a project that is run by our local authority, London Borough of Hackney, called the Hackney 100, and this gives local school kids an opportunity to come and work for a couple of hours after school while they during term time. And so, roughly speaking, it's about 40 to 60 hours work experience in total, I think, that we commit to. And that is hugely valuable for the young person, because in that period of time they're coming in on a regular basis after school, and they learn about the work environment and how businesses work and how the organisation works and how people interact and the importance of teamwork and all those things. And so I think that's really, that kind of programme works well. So I think if there's a degree of flexibility around how those 45 or 60 days can work, then maybe it kind of provides the kind of value that businesses need. But I think it's really important. Businesses there's got to be business value out of offering a T-level work placement, because if there's not, sorry,
you go. Sorry, Anthony.
Well, as I was going to say, if there's not, then the work placements that will be made available will be those that are done as part of a CSR initiative, which will be fine, but will not be at the scale that's needed in order to properly implement this policy.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, to be fair, one of the things the government are clear on, it won't be 2 weeks, to your point, and as I said earlier, because at the end of the day, that would just be the filing in the coffee. But you're right, equally, given the programme you just mentioned about the Hackney 100, there's an opportunity there to have even greater flexibility and maybe give young people more choice and more variety by breaking it up into smaller chunks of time. I suppose one of the questions that we've been talking to a number of employers about is, what if it was even longer? What if it was, for example, the last 6 months, remember this is a 2-year programme, if maybe the last 6 months of that 2 years became almost the applied work placement element of it, and that could then naturally ladder into an employer being able to use that as a kind of a talent assessment. And so after that 6 months, maybe the young person, there would be a real benefit for the employer saying, you know what, I'm ready to take that young person onto an apprenticeship or a higher level apprenticeship, or even offer them a job. So there are different ways that I think we could maybe start to think more creatively about how importantly the work experience, work placement could be really truly embedded, so the employer doesn't just see it as a bit of a CSR or even a bit of a nuisance factor. They see it as something that's really added value to actually helping them with their future talent pool. And then there are other practicalities, like we spoke to employers, for example, in the care sector, who say, just practicalities like CRB checks. There's lots of practicalities that might make it very impossible to offer shorter work experiences. But again, if you thought about something that was a lot longer and you made it almost part of a work placement internship as you move from T levels into apprenticeships or another program, then that could actually have some greater value.
I think if those kind of initiatives are embraced, then it does become part of an organisation's talent strategy, and so yes, I completely agree. If there's that interconnection between the two qualifications and the two routes, then absolutely it works. But that comes back to our earlier point around making sure that there is that the connection, so somebody can do a T level, do the work experience, and then move on to an apprenticeship or a degree level of apprenticeship or something that enables them to continue their career.
And actually, that's perfect lead in. So thank you for that, Anthony. Perfect lead into our last slide, actually, which is about that all important progression. We're tending to get too obsessed in the sector talking about prestige at that kind of higher level, at level 3, 4, 5, 6. But actually, for me, prestige is about progression, and you can have prestige at a level 2 as much as you can at level 3, and so on. And so, really, what you've just articulated there is how the progression currently is planned to operate from a T level. So you've got someone doing their level 2, their GCSEs or tech awards at school, and then they make their choices to either go on a T level route or they go on to an academic route. And this is where I really have probably my biggest fundamental problem with the proposed reforms right now. As you can see quite clearly, that's forcing a stark binary choice for a young person. So I'm having to choose a T level over an academic route, or vice versa. And I don't really see how that actually starts to deliver as parity. Although I think there does need to be clear progression. I think there's a strong belief that you can mesh together both technical and academic, and therefore you can allow 16 to 18-year-olds to be able to do both. At the point that they then get to 18, they're then better able to decide whether they want to carry on with a work-based route, such as a work-based degree or an apprenticeship, or whether they do want to go into the more formal HE degree role. So at the moment, the plan is, as you've seen on this slide, is for the T levels to operate in this way, but certainly we very much placed emphasis in the consultation back to government that we think it should be more fluid than that and not force this binary choice that we can see on this slide in front of us. And again, Anthony, I don't know if you've got a particular view before we start thinking about opening this back out for the audience, but whether you've got a particular view on how the progression should play through.
Do you know, I'm actually just really depressed by this slide. Not because it's beautiful graphics. It's not what makes me depressed by it. I'm just really depressed because it's you know, the lack of, it needs 2 hours to make this diagram work. It needs 2 arrows so that you can go from a level 3 technical route and you can go and do a degree, and likewise a level 3 academic route and go and do a higher level technical qualification. I just think it's so single track, and this is not how this has never been how young people have chosen careers. Because, you know, I speak to lots of young people who get to the end of their degree and don't know what they want to do.
Exactly.
I reflect on myself just for a moment. I went to university, studied architecture, and ended up in a career in tech. And you know, so even at the age of 21, 22, I was still making career choices then. And I just think this just is not how careers are built. And it's a really, academically I understand, the theory of this I completely understand, but in practice, this is not how the world really works.
No, and I'm really glad you've articulated that from both your personal but also your view as an employer, because as I said, this is to me the most woeful part of the current aspect of the reforms. You know, as I said right at the beginning, it's really laudable that the government recognise the need to ensure that we've got a technical system fit for the 21st century. And then you get to this last slide, which talks about that all-important progression into the destination. And you think, is that really then going to give us a system that's fit for the 21st century? So listen, on that note, I think it's probably a really good opportunity for us to pause and go to our second and last poll question and ask the audience whether, having asked at the beginning what they knew about T-levels or how much they'd heard, find out if we've managed to move their thinking on before we hand back to Mary for some questions. So if we can just go now to our second poll question, which is, now that you hopefully know a little bit more about T-levels from Anthony and myself, what do you believe is the most important thing to get right for you as an employer so that you actually benefit? Is it providing the right support for you to get involved in those all-important work placements? Is it ensuring that the T-level provides a progression route into apprenticeships? Or is it focusing on maintaining a high-quality level 2 offer alongside T-levels? And so we'll be able to use your responses to this as part of our ongoing debate that we're having with the policy people in government. So it'll be really interesting to see if you have a particular strong view coming out of the conversations that Anthony and I have just been having. So this is really your opportunity to determine where would you most focus your energy in respect to how you might choose to support the T-level programme now you know a little bit more about it. And again, Anthony, it'll be interesting to see where our audience land on this, really. I'm half expecting work placements to The poll's actually open now, just by the way, but I'm half expecting people to be very interested in work placements, but equally, I can imagine people feeling as passionate as we do and you do around progression and level 2. What do you think?
Well, I mean, you can see the results on the screen now. I mean, I think I was just reflecting a bit on what you said earlier about feedback to government, and that while I think a lot is still to be decided, the impression that I get from people that I talk to in the Department for Education is that they really, really want feedback, and they especially want feedback from employers, and that the design that they have for the system is not a fixed and final design, but it is something that they will adapt and change according to feedback that they get. So I think while my last comment about the last slide we saw was a bit downbeat, at the same time, I think actually, there is a lot of listening going on. And so as a community of employers on this call, I think there's a lot that we can do in order to get the system to look and work in the way that meets the needs of employers.
Great. Now, and as we saw there, number 38 seems to be our popular number today. So we've got 38% talking about wanting to get involved in work placement. So hopefully you've been helped in terms of understanding what that might look like. And 38% saying that T-levels need to provide that all-important progression route into apprenticeship. So that's been really helpful. Thank you for giving us your input there, the audience. And thank you also, Anthony, for all that engagement in that debate. So I think probably this is where we can hand back to Mary and see whether there's any more questions.
Thank you, Kirstie and Anthony, for a really insightful presentation. I think it's clear that there's still a lot of work to be done and a lot of questions still outstanding around the issue of T-levels, but it's one that really needs to be on employers' agendas. Okay, so now we have around 10 minutes or so for some questions from the audience. Just a reminder that you can pose these at the right-hand side of your screen using the chat facility, and we'll try and get through as many as we can before we have to wrap up. I see we've already got a few come in, so I'd like to kick off with a question from me to start with. Kirstie, Anthony, how do you think we can convince young people, but also their parents, of the value of T-levels?
I think that's a brilliant question. We've been having the same debate for the last few years about how do you convince parents and young people of the values of apprenticeships, because it kind of falls in the same category really, because most parents understandably want the best for their children. And I was involved in the Demos Apprenticeship Commission a few years ago, and the piece of research we did when we went out and asked him and parents, what do you think about apprenticeships? And I think something like over 90% of them said, wow, they sound like a great thing, we should bring them back, absolutely. And then when we said, well, would you send your son and daughter on an apprenticeship, it dropped right back to sort of the very low 30s. So I think the same is true of T-levels, because there's not a currency that is well understood yet outside of A-levels and GCSEs, then of course parents are always going to default to wanting their young children to go through those traditional routes. So that's why it's so important that more and more employers talk to the kind of skills that they're looking for that actually maybe probably are much more aligned to things like T-level programs, because if T-levels give their son and daughter the better opportunity to get into work, get into a good job, still earn and learn, as we say, then actually what a fantastic opportunity instead of or alongside, the more traditional academic routes. I think the other thing that's changing now, of course, is the financial aspects of going through university, where obviously parents are having to make harder choices about how and where they help their children invest in their education. So I think it will take a long time, but it's no doubt is part of the shifting agenda, is how do we convince parents, because parents probably have the biggest influence on the choices their children make.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Guys, can you hear me now?
Oh, there's a bit of background noise there. I think I think people ultimately default to what they know, and so whenever you introduce something new, that is the biggest challenge. And I agree. I think to convince parents is going to take quite a long time, because actually A-levels and going to university is so embedded in the perception of a successful start to a career, that it's going to be very difficult to shift that. I think to some extent, going back to the pressing diagram that the last diagram we had, I think it's just very important that if you do a T level, it shouldn't prevent you from going on to university. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah.
So I think parents is really challenging, and as you said, Kirstie, we've had many conversations around convincing parents about the merits of apprenticeships over going to university, and I think that's going to keep running and running for a long time. I think I'm a little bit more optimistic around convincing young people to do T levels, because I think young people have got access to knowledge about careers and access to information about careers that they've never had before. And I think the successful use of social media and the internet means that actually young people have got this wealth of information around career choices that they can make. And so I think young people are much more savvy about things that will take them on a successful pathway. And I think we're beginning to, potentially, we're seeing this fall in university numbers. I'm hoping that will correspond to more young people doing apprenticeships, because they see that as a much more viable way to start their career, not just financially, but actually gives them a better toolkit to be successful moving forward.
And as the name suggests, T levels are technically based, but a lot of employers we speak to say they're actually looking for soft skills from future talent, such as creativity, problem solving, that sort of thing. Kirstie and Anthony, would you agree with that? And what might need to happen to help young people build on these skills? Is the kind of the 45 to 60 day work placement window the answer to that within the T level?
I mean, if I just jump in, and then I'm sure Anthony will jump in. I think it's the right intent. Whether it's the absolutely right vehicle to do it, I think, is probably what we've been talking about on this call, really. There's no doubt that, as Anthony used his paper round and I use my lettuce cutting job, we'll have learned skills about how to work with people and just working along, older people, younger people, more diverse people. So you soak all of that up. And so there's no doubt that the work placement would be a good part of creating that employability spine that almost needs to run through the whole T level. And to be fair, let's remember that on the slide that I showed earlier, the makeup of a T level program, it had that core box, which was talking about all the transferable skills, as well as the concepts and theories that will need to be learnt and taught. And there's also an area for more enrichment experiences to be part of the T level. So I think there is being very positive. There is an intent and a recognition that the T level program has to include those, Mary. So you're absolutely right. And do I believe that that's what employers want? Absolutely. Every piece of research that I have been involved in the sort of 7 years I've now been with City and Guilds with employers has always systematically come back to those all important employability, soft skills, resilience, whatever you want to call them. And so I think it's time that we absolutely do agree. What do they look like? What is a common spine of employability skills that employers would all agree almost needed to be taught and learned, as well as actually just felt by any young person who wants to move into that occupational area?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because, talking about employability skills you earn doing a T level, actually, in truth, you want everybody to have employability skills, whether they do a T level or an A level. And so just kind of thinking that through, are we actually building a system? Are we building a system with T levels? Because actually we're saying A levels aren't producing the kind of education that young people need in order to join the workforce. So we'll create a new system in parallel to it that actually does that and gives those young people those employability skills that mean that they can join the workforce. So if that's the logical conclusion, are we actually talking about the end of A levels in the long term, because actually they're just not fit for purpose?
I think
so. It's controversial. There's controversial.
Very interesting point, and actually, sort of extending that, I'd almost say as well that what age do you start employability? Why does it only start at 16? Why aren't we doing more right down from 7 upwards? I mean, there are other key stages within the education system. It doesn't all start at 16.
Yeah, completely agree.
Okay, and we've had another question come through. So David is asking, I thought that the proposal was after completing a T-level or an A-level, a learner would be able to transfer over to another route. Can you clarify whether this would be the case?
So let me make sure I've understood the question, Mary. So I think at the point, so if someone was on a T-level, completed their T-level after 2 years, then yes, they could progress onto an apprenticeship for sure. They wouldn't progress back into another two-year T-level program per se. What actually happens to those people who only get so far with a T-level and don't for some reason complete it all, I think is still part of the actual policy reform debate that's going on at the moment. But the whole idea is that there is progression from a T-level, and as we talked about on that last slide, you go from a level 3 T-level into either a high level degree or a higher level apprenticeship, or indeed you can get employed, but you don't necessarily go back into a T-level. Equally, if you're doing your A-levels, you do your A-levels and then you pass or fail and you go on to a degree if that's what you choose to do. And that's part of the conversation Anthony and I was having. It's far too binary and too stark.
Yeah.
And next questions come in from Manya. She says, the 45 to 60 day work placement can be too short. You talked about the possibility of this being longer. Is that part of the ongoing discussions at the moment?
Part of the our response, so City and Guilds response, which we also did with a number of employers, not least people like Anthony would have been part of that. So we've certainly we certainly put forward ideas. I've certainly been talking to very senior people in the government policy world about the alternative. So it's fair to say that I think, as Anthony said before, the government are in listening mode. There is an opportunity to influence right now, and ultimately, you employers have the biggest influence on this agenda. Actually, I know it might not feel like it, but actually, the more that the government realise that is what you want, if that is what you want, then the more that we have a chance to actually reflect the policy in that direction.
Right, we're rapidly running out of time here, but I'd just like to finally ask Kirstie and Anthony, what would be your message to our audience on the webinar today? A lot of them are kind of looking after future talent and resourcing that. You mentioned, Kirstie, that there's a real opportunity here for employers. So what would be your final call to action to the people listening today?
Well, I'll quickly say, and then I'll let Anthony have the last word then. But I mean, I think it really is on that last question before, really. If you've got a view on some of this, let us know and let government know. You do need to realise that this is about your future talent pool. So do get involved in any way you can to think about what really will work for you, for your occupations, for your sector, because actually this is a real chance for you to actually shape the thinking. And then ultimately, hopefully that means you will get involved at the time that the T-levels become live, and you'll want to get involved because it'll better suit the kind of programme that you'd be looking to support.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what you just said, Kirstie. I think it's really important for employers to feed into the system. I think, coming back to some comments that I made earlier around the skills gaps in the economy and the pressure that the economy is going to be under in a few years' time, I think employers have to take an active role in defining the system. As employers, we should be beneficiaries of a high quality education system, and I think we've got an opportunity in order to input into it and shape it. And I think I would ask everybody who's on this call to really think about what they want from the system and feedback, probably into you guys at City and Guilds, in order to kind of give that feedback into the government, so that we end up with a system that really is producing that caliber of talent that we need in across the UK economy.
Okay, fantastic. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but I'd just like to say a big thank you to Kirstie and Anthony. Just a reminder, we'll be sending the recorded version of the webinar out in the next few days, so please do look out for that in your emails. And once again, thank you all for taking the time to join us today, to Kirstie and to Anthony, and to the City and Guilds group. If you have any further questions or feedback on the webinar you've heard today, please do contact us using the contact details on the screen now. Okay, that concludes the session today, and we look forward to welcoming you to another Changeboard webinar very soon. Have a very good afternoon.